Peregrine, welcome to the show.
DK, good to be here.
Thanks for coming by. So I've kind of been new getting into making these kinds of videos and sort of recording audio content and talking to people. And you're like a few steps ahead of me because you already sort of you're kind of new in your journey, I think, but further ahead from kind of what I'm doing. So I thought it'd be fun to get together and chat about sort of how to make a podcast. How did you decide to make a podcast? Kind of what are your motivations? How does it fit into your overall portfolio of things you're working on and doing? And that's kind of the goal here. So maybe it's good to start with a little bit of kind of who you are, what's your background, to just give people a bit of context on how you came to this.
Sounds good. Yeah, happy to give a quick intro on myself. My name is Peregrine. I grew up in Rhode Island, and ever since I was a kid, I wanted to use technology to make the world a better place. So originally in undergrad, I studied medical devices because they're cool engineered objects. Like I love engineering, but medical devices are also a very pure expression of using technology to help people. You have this concrete physical thing, and you can duplicate it and ship it around the world, combine it with a sick person to save a life. It's like very straightforward. So that's sort of where I started. And then I realized that medical device world is typically slow. Typically you kind of get an MD, PhD, or you spend 10 years in the industry, and then you can start a company, which I really wanted to do. And so I swapped over to computer science. I heard about the social network, and I think that Andreessen essay, Software is Eating the World, came out in a similar time frame.
Right.
And so studied CS for a little bit and then dropped out, worked on a software startup in New York City building software for nonprofits. It was a YC company. And then went back to school for a little bit and then dropped out a second time to help start a robotics company out here in Silicon Valley. And did that for a few years, amazing people, really, really complex technology, really fun. And then I started my own company in the affordable housing space. So trying to solve the affordable housing crisis in the Bay Area. Did that for a little bit. Our goal was making housing very, very dense. So we had this sort of regulatory hack to enable very high levels of density, which turned out to intersect poorly with COVID.
Right.
And so I shut the company down and ended up in venture capital, which is really fun. And I met a firm called 50 Years. We back teams that work on the world's most important problems. So things like climate change or healthcare. And things have sort of come full circle because I actually get to support some teams on medical devices as well as some of those other areas. Yeah.
Right. That's awesome. And so you're kind of in venture capital now it's been a couple of years?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've been here almost 2 years. Yeah.
And have you already done other types of media creation thing, or is the new podcast kind of the core kind of media creation activity you've been doing?
Yeah, before that, I wrote a few blog posts and I published one of them. And I would say I read a lot. I mean, I read a lot of media, but in terms of creation, that one blog post I think it was about how to do your first fundraise in deep tech, kind of a fun exercise. And then, this podcast.
And how did you when you made the blog post, did you get feedback online? Did you sort of connect with new people, or kind of what was that experience like?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think at the time I literally just had an OKR to write blog posts. It was just a goal I set. And then I had this draft and I sent it out to a bunch of people for feedback. I think you might have left me a few comments, or Jen might have left me some comments, but I took that and graded it and published it. It's currently the one blog post I have on my Substack.
Nice. And then what sort of was the motivation to get into podcasting? How did you decide to kind of kick off this project?
Yeah. I think there's a few ingredients. I mean, I've always enjoyed asking questions and talking to people and getting to know people. I've always enjoyed sort of putting on a show and creating a performance. And right before I decided to do the podcast, we actually read Amp It Up by Frank Slootman as a team. And so, occasionally we would read books as a team, and I read it and I just got really inspired. Frank is a very cool guy. The book it sort of created a lot of energy in the team, and a lot of urgency. We actually have our team values with this poster on the wall here. And the one for urgency is so there's a poster, and the value is called relentlessly effective. and the image on the poster is an hourglass, like, with sand, and then it's on fire. And yeah, I think like that value of, trying to move really fast and moving with a lot of urgency, really just expresses, our day to day well. And so, I sort of read this book and had that value kind of shifting around. And I thought, one thing I love doing is asking people questions. What if I started a podcast to ask people who move really fast how they do it? And I think the other ingredient was I'd met entrepreneurs who were outside the Valley ecosystem. And, sort of speed of execution, velocity is one thing that we think a lot about, right? It's just so core to having a big impact in the world. And I would talk to them and I would say, hey, I think one thing you need to calibrate on here is like how fast you need to be able to move in order to succeed here. And they would say, oh, how do I calibrate on that? And it's actually a hard question, right? Because, for each independent industry, there's sort of its own competencies. Role models are easy to Google, but hard to get details on. And so my honest answer to them was like, you should cold call and cold email a whole bunch of top founders that are in adjacent industries and just try and hop on the phone with them and ask them what they do. But it's pretty intimidating. And, those founders are often very busy, and the sort of most successful ones prioritize their time very effectively. And so there's not always an openness to somebody completely random asking for advice for a half-hour phone call. And so I sort of thought like, okay, if I could, create these stories or talk to people and, learn these stories, then we could publish them and I could recommend it to founders like that and say, hey, like, it might be hard to get a hold of this person, but I got a hold of them and here's this cool story you can listen to about how they move fast.
Yeah, it's a great pattern I've seen again and again, which is people are kind of answering the same questions or trying to answer a set of questions again and again in life. And then, you just say, well, instead of, having the same conversation 10, 12, 15 times, I'll just create a piece of media that sort of answers the question that you can point to it. So do you already have like people lined up when you're starting the podcast that you intend to be, episodes 1 through 5, or do you sort of like do episode 1 and then figure out episode 2, or kind of how does the whole work come together in your mind?
Yeah, I think for most podcasts, there is a sort of right answer here, which is have a rough idea of the theme or the idea you want to explore and read a little bit about it, write a little bit about it, and really try and understand it and understand, sort of the high level framework. And then pick out a bunch of guests and try to reach out to them and see who you can get. And if you create a backlog of recorded episodes that are ready to be published, it definitely makes life easier. So, if you record an episode and then you're trying to publish every single week, being forced to schedule something for that week, record it, edit it, and publish it is extraordinarily hard. I would not recommend that approach. And so if instead you build up a backlog, you sort of have this buffer where if somebody needs to reschedule, you can go to the backlog. If, somebody schedules 2 weeks out and, you don't have anything that week to record and then publish, you'll still be okay. And so definitely having a backlog is the way to go.
And so keeping that weekly cadence is really important. Is that kind of just from helping people remember that you exist in that cadence, or is there other goals there?
Yeah, I would say it's a rule of thumb that, I haven't studied podcasting in a ton of detail. Like, I'm not sure anyone's run the double-blind controlled study of what happens if you run, weekly versus, you miss a week. How bad is it? But I think the idea is that you create an expectation in listeners' minds, and so you can build an audience that relies on you for this sort of predictable, interesting content, or interesting content at a predictable cadence might be a better way to put that. Right.
So you have this theme of speed, which is kind of the answer. I mean, it's the title of the podcast, but it's also the answer to the question that I think sort of motivated the creation of the thing. And do you feel like the people that you want to talk to about speed are typically underexposed on podcasts or underexposed on this topic, and you're sort of bringing this topic to light or bringing these personalities to light, or some of each?
Yeah, definitely underexposed on the topic. Some of the folks I interview are very eloquent and are extremely good communicators. And so other people have realized that they'll make great podcast guests, and
Right.
those people, are at a spot in their career where they're happy to do it. So some of them do have, other shows they've been on, and but I think the particular angle and the questions we ask and the expertise and, context that I have, talking to a lot of companies in these verticals ends up being fairly unique. And so I would say folks generally, might get asked about their personal story or might get asked about, how did things unfold in a company, but it's very, very rare that a founder will be asked to drill down into how many weeks it took to ship a particular prototype.
Mm-hmm. And so you're basically, your calling card in a sense is that you have a different set of questions and different set of like ideas that you're trying to expose. So even if a person has been on a lot of podcasts and kind of done their tour, you actually have a kind of unique perspective you're bringing to it. So
that's the hope. Yeah.
So when you're, I'm trying to imagine your sort of pre-launch, you have 0 subscribers on Spotify or whatever. How do you land your first, 2 guests, first 5 guests?
Yeah. I think the first few people we mostly landed through the 50 Years Network. So we've backed a lot of incredible teams. I think roughly 20% of the teams we backed in Fund 1 are now running unicorn companies, so companies that are worth $1 billion. And so, we have connections to these people and we've supported them over years. And so, part of it is they trust us to create effective content. And if they spend time doing this, if they spend an hour and a half on a call with me, they trust us to create an asset that will, do right by them. So those first few people were part of it. And then, my old CTO, at one of my old companies was part of it. I just have other friends who are in these networks who are open to chatting. And I think the premise reaching out to them is like, hey, I'm going to make you look really good. And when, this video gets shown and a potential employee watches it, they're going to get inspired. And we've had folks reach out to me saying like, hey, I remember one person reached out and he said, hey, my current job is all right. I'm not super pumped to be here, but it's all right. But I heard this episode with Chris Best on Substack and the founding story of Substack and their philosophy. And he said that Chris's iteration speed and his default time to get contact with reality, Chris has this concept, contact with reality, where you can get feedback from the real world, was just really inspiring. And the employee was like, I really just loved that idea and I want to learn from people like that. And so, then I've shared his information with Chris. Right. And so
you first had Chris on the podcast, and presumably this individual, did they find the podcast through the Chris episode, or they just knew about it otherwise and then kind of Chris came on?
I should have, I think he might have mentioned, I'm in, a social group. I'm in a whole bunch of like Slack groups. So I was in a Slack group with this person. And then I think he saw it through the Slack group. Yeah.
Right. Cool. And when you're sort of, starting from scratch, you've got a few good guests that you have in your network from kind of years of support. And then I guess people are already starting to discover it and get value from the fact that the content is now out there. So do you feel like there are areas that you want to, maybe amp up is the right way to say it? Or are there things that, like, it seems like the core engine is basically working, but like, do you feel like it's, your plan is you've got the playbook and just execute it? Or are you sort of always looking for, how do I find more alpha? How do I get the right bits in front of the right people? And sort of how much does that occupy your mind?
Yeah, a lot these days. I think in the first month and a half of launching this show, a lot of it was just, how do I make these assets? How do we ask the right questions at the right time? How do there's all these little details around show production. But after we'd sort of got a few of these episodes up, I started thinking a little bit more about this. And now that we're getting close to the end of season 1, started to think a lot about it is, how do we take those very long assets, these are hour shows, and make them more accessible. So make short snippets that we can share, get the transcripts kind of fully polished and online, all the things that create discoverability. It's funny, you were actually making this great point, which is that in podcasting world, there's sort of this wall where if you're on Apple Podcasts and Spotify and all the RSS feed set of podcasts, but you're not on YouTube, then or other sort of text-based things are getting crawled by Google, then your content is just not that discoverable. You're sort of behind this invisible wall of podcasting. And so we've started getting transcripts going. We've got episodes uploading to YouTube with like full transcripts. We started recording video. The first few, I was like, video, it just adds more complexity, so like we shouldn't record it. And some of the guests were like, it's more relaxing to not be on video. But we sort of realized that like short form video, you don't absolutely need the video of the guest, but it definitely makes it more engaging. So we started recording video recently.
Okay, cool. Yeah, because you have the audio tracks on YouTube, but with some sort of like overlaid video, some synthesized video or like waveform of the voices. Yeah. Okay.
So that's sort of what we're doing for the first few episodes, and then for the most recent ones, I think we're going to have 3 or so that have video with them.
Cool. And is that more remote stuff or in person, or you've sort of explored both of those?
The 3, we did one episode with John from Astranis that was in person. We didn't record video, but that was wonderful. I mean, I think you just get different things, right? Like, we're collaborating with very, very busy people, right? These are very successful founders of very large organizations. And so, getting it to a physical location and then getting back or, wherever their home is definitely like a big time investment.
Right.
And so, I think, we often just offer remote because I would say it's, 90% is good. And if it enables it to happen at all and it wouldn't happen otherwise, then, it's way better. So.
Right. Makes sense. And then have you kind of explored, I think the sort of one-on-one podcast format is, well understood and well explored. And I wonder if there are other formats that you might have explored for kind of engaging these people and creating stuff that is, I don't know, a little bit of newer takes on things. So, examples, the one-on-one podcast, he's been around for maybe a decade or so, but like things like All In are a different format of like 4 friends kind of all talking, and then they have like they inject sometimes guests, but it's not really like a host versus guest show. That's just like one format, but you can imagine, tons of format innovation. So is that something that you're curious about or have thought about, or kind of where do you land on that?
It's a good question. One that came to mind, this was maybe a month ago, was actually somebody that we got introduced to who was thinking about raising money for his company, and he'd worked at SpaceX. And so he and I chatted about having a couple of SpaceX folks on sort of at the same time and talking about maybe a couple different projects at SpaceX. I think there's sort of a warmth and openness that could come from some of the camaraderie there. But for season 1, we're sort of just trying to get things working. And mostly focused on this format, which I think it's definitely more traditional. But the stories people are telling are often fairly detailed. And, I think like, I guess we could do like, a founder and like an early employee, or a founder and somebody else. I think for Solugen, we might do both the founders at the same time, but we just haven't quite gotten on the experimentation side there.
Right. Yeah, I think the format innovation stuff seems pretty ripe because there's not many people exploring that, and I think it can create like a very different feel to the kind of content you create. So I've, as I'm sort of launching this, kind of exploration of like, recording and publishing stuff, mostly video format. I've been asking myself like, well, what kinds of formats might be fun? Like, is in-person worth the extra lift, and is, or is remote good enough because the ideas and stories are so new? And then, we had a dinner party the other night where we had, 5 of us around a table talking about, have you read the State of AI report? There's a
I don't know. Yeah, maybe not.
Really, it's like 114 slides or so. They do it every year. They just published the recent one maybe a month or 2 ago. So we had like 5 people around a dinner table, all kind of, experts in different areas in AI. and I was like, oh man, I wish I just had cameras and everybody cameraed and mic'd up, and this would be like a great media asset to publish. I don't know if it's quite fits in the podcast domain or more YouTube domain, but I think that format innovation is something that I've been personally excited about, just because I think there's a lot of underexplored area there.
Yeah. Especially with ChatGPT and this sort of AI folks are doing around this content. I think ChatGPT is obviously what's the word? It has significant safeguards right now, and so it can't surf the internet. It can't do basic things like give me the 10 links about X. Right? It can't do that yet, but I think there's sort of a spectrum with those AI tools where initially, they sort of start where they are, and then at a certain point, they're going to get opened to the internet in terms of their queryability. So you'll be able to say, give me the top 10 links in X. But people are already actually running podcasts through Whisper, the OpenAI transcription model, and then taking those transcripts and training a Q&A bot based on them. And you can do neural search. So that's just sort of semantic search where you type in a term and it tries to find similar terms. And I think that could be really fascinating too eventually, because when you think about conversation in 10 years, at least sort of professional conversations, there's probably going to be AI constantly running on what you're saying and then suggesting kind of next questions and new ideas. And, if you said this to Elon, what would he say? Right. If you said this to Jeff Bezos, who would he, and you can imagine a podcast format almost more like live streaming in its sort of engagement or interactivity, or the amount it jumps from topic to topic, and sort of enabled by those tools. So I don't know if I'm going to be the one to pioneer that, but I think it's very interesting ideas that are going to come about because of that.
Right. At what point in time do you actually have GPT chat generating the questions, and maybe Synthesia AI or somebody else generating the voice and the persona, and your podcast runs itself? Yeah.
It's a great question. I mean, I think the tricky part about AI is that it doesn't yet have the context, enough context to ask really interesting follow-ups.
Right.
And so I think, we've actually used ChatGPT to just out of curiosity to ask it, what should we ask George Church, right? That was a podcast we did recently, and it had some interesting questions, but I think it would struggle with how does the culture of SpaceX compare to the church lab and why? Then when there's an answer, sort of picking up on how the answer was expressed and saying, oh, but isn't there an exception here? I think that sort of thing is going to be challenging for AI for a long time.
Right. Yeah, it's a very human quality to be able to take what happened and sort of inject it and use it to pull threads from a past part of a conversation. So, for example, actually, one thing that I wanted to ask you that you've mentioned a few times already that is a very human thing, I think a attention window of an AI wouldn't necessarily capture it, is you mentioned the seasons. And I think the idea of having season one of a podcast both kind of makes sense, but also feels a little arbitrary. And I think having content packaged in seasons makes sense from kind of a Netflix perspective, and I think from I think Fortnite has seasons of content. And how do you think about I think the traditional podcast is I don't know, episode number 136 is whatever, and you've sort of chosen to go down the route of having seasons, and I wonder sort of, was that super explicit? Did you discuss it? Did you debate? Is it just the obvious thing to do today, or what? Why seasons?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think it would be trivial to not have seasons by just editing the assets so that the season one disappears. But I think it also creates a sort of creative space. When you think about trying to launch a polished show episode every single week, it's definitely challenging, right? I mean, there's a lot that goes into prepping for these shows, getting up to speed on the topic area, going through the transcripts afterwards, even cutting out filler words. It doesn't sound hard, but doing it well takes time. And there's coordination between different people, and, there's all of this. And so I think part of it is a sort of a communication with our listeners that at a certain point, we might say, hey, it's the end of season 1. We're not going to publish any new content for a few weeks. I'm also having a kid soon, so
right.
heads up with that.
So it's like a little bit of a planned vacation.
Yeah, exactly. And so, yeah, I think like, you sort of communicate that to your listeners by having like a season 1 to season 2, and it creates this creative freedom, right? We could sort of say, okay, season 2 is going to be much more about the like operators, like early operators, right? And less about founders. There's, to get a real like glimpse into SpaceX, for example, it might be way more effective to interview 10 of the first couple hundred engineers at SpaceX than it would be to interview Elon. I mean, Elon would get sort of more views, and I'm sure it'd be fun in its own right for a variety of reasons. But it's like gonna just be less descriptive than 10 hours of content interviewing a bunch of SpaceX engineers. And I think similar for ByteDance or Alibaba, or I think there's lots of examples that come to mind.
Yeah, totally. I think there's an interesting point in there, which is like there's probably a ton of people who have a ton of interesting stories and just never have a place to tell them, right? So like Elon has plenty of places to tell, any story he wants. Now owns one of the big places for telling stories. But engineer number 7 at SpaceX, if he's not under some sort of very tightly controlled, NDA or kind of a PR agreement, probably has tons of interesting, how did you decide to work on this? What did it look like when you showed up? Like, I think it's just like infinitely interesting, and probably I've got to imagine there's like tons of interest in that because there's more people who are considering joining the next SpaceX than are considering being the next Elon Musk.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
So on the seasons, it sounds like the vacation imperative is maybe one of the leading factors, and then this kind of like topic centric gathering is another one. But I could imagine too that like if season 1 is about founders and season 2 is about operators, what happens if you're like in the middle of recording season 2 and then like this great founder shows up on your doorstep on accident, or you bump into him at a dinner or something?
Yeah. I don't know if we would try and tie a narrative to seasons quite so tightly. I mean, it's maybe more like The Simpsons than a modern Netflix show, right? Right. Yeah, right. I don't know if we would stress out about that. I mean, my sense is that, occasionally it's the right time for a guest. They're thinking about hiring, or they're thinking about doing PR for the new company, right? And they just really want to talk about it, and they're down to make the scheduling work. And then, we know that they're super talented and they're going to have some amazing stories. And so we make it happen. I think, so far it's much more about, I think if I ran this show for another like 2 years, I might start thinking about like, okay, we've got a massive amount of incredible content. What would we do with it? I think like, shaping the seasons is not currently at the top of my list of like most important things.
Right. How is you mentioned sort of the workflows and the effort that goes into it with the preparation and the actual execution and then the transcripting and the publishing and sharing in different places. Like what does that workflow actually look like? Is it, like, can you walk me through, a single episode or maybe your first episode? Like, what did it look like? And is it kind of the same now or has it evolved?
Yeah. I think every episode's a little bit different because there's sort of something the founder wants to talk about. And so I try and center the research around that. The first episode was with Deepika of Athellis, which is a kind of incredible healthcare company. And it's funny that you asked because I was literally doing the research on a plane flight, and I think that there was like no internet on the flight. I was about to lose connection, so I just opened like 100 tabs about Athellis. And I was going through and reading these various reports about Athellis and what they'd created. And my goal is really just build as much of a model of the company as possible from the public information. So, you know, for Athelis, it was like every one of their products and being able to sort of say like, okay, here's the product. I kind of understand who the user might be, and I kind of understand, you know, what the value prop is. So that, you know, when the founder mentions it offhand, I might not double click on it and say, hey, just FYI for listeners, this is X, Y, and Z. But at least I know internally, so I can sort of like, you know, keep track of what's going on.
Right.
So that's like the main sort of research component. And then,
and is that like an hour or two? Like open up 100 tabs, take a flight, do it. Then it's kind of done. Is that about an hour or two of research?
Yeah. Sometimes it's a bit more. Sometimes I have another couple of folks on the team that will contribute in various ways. And sometimes they'll put together like a list of podcasts the person's previously been on, or like the person's co-founder. So, for example, Calvin from Segment, his co-founder Peter has been on a bunch of podcasts. I think Calvin's been on a couple. And so I listened to like, one of Calvin's and then a couple of Peter's. And yeah, those can be, it's sort of a different type of work. So it might be another couple of hours, but often you're like, going for a walk or working out or something. It's slightly more relaxing.
Right. So you do that prep ahead, and I assume you've done some outreach and some scheduling, and you kind of already have that, like that was a pre-test to make sure that you are researching the person who's actually going to show up. And then do you record with like Riverside or some of these remote tools or?
Yeah, typically we use Riverside. I think the first one, I think every single one we've used Riverside. We looked at doing sort of a different setup, and it just seemed harder. It seemed like if we were going to do remote, then Riverside or one of its competitors was going to be fine. And we saw other podcast hosts that we respect using Riverside, and we were just like, okay, seems fine. So.
And then you sort of have is the recording designed to be an hour and a half, and then you're going to do a lot of post-production or editing, or do you imagine you're going to kind of just give it one take, or how do you think about kind of both what you're recording and how it maps to what you imagine is finally going to be published?
Yeah. I mean, we target an hour of recording, and sometimes we go over by a little bit. And then, I mean, historically there's been a little bit of editing. We obviously add an intro and an outro. Sometimes if something is sometimes the founders will express something that just requires more context to actually understand. So I'll record a little blurb about like what is going on here, just to make sure the listeners understand the context. So yeah, that's sort of the process of like, kind of an hour-ish, and then it gets compressed a little bit, and then I add on some of these other pieces.
Right. And do you do you just sort of hand that asset to your editor, or do you do some sort of lightweight editing yourself to try to highlight pieces that you want to focus on? Or
yeah, it's a mix. I mean, I would say there's like removing filler words. So unless people try hard, there's generally filler words that slip through, the sort of likes and ums and all that jazz. So the editor definitely goes after those. And then there's sometimes content that's just a little bit less interesting. I haven't thought critically about a sort of formal framework to describe this, but intuitively it just feels like there's a thread to the conversation, and maybe you leave that thread for a little bit, but you generally sort of like come back to it. And sometimes there's just sort of a tangent that isn't really that interesting, or it doesn't like quite address the thread, and so then we just cut that out. But yeah, I think that's like the rough process.
And then once you've got your kind of final, it's mostly in audio historically, but now you're dabbling with video a bit. But once you've got your final, say, audio track or video track, do you then just like push it out to like Spotify, iTunes? Do you use those like third party, like, I don't know, Simplecast or whatever?
Yep.
To host?
Yeah, exactly. We use Simplecast, and it just does it all for you.
Which you just push it there, and then it pushes it everywhere you need to be.
Yeah, it's generally good. There are, some slightly buggy services, like some of the podcast players are not super well maintained and have issues. But if you just use Simplecast, then it works well on Spotify and Apple Podcasts and a couple of the other readers, and ends up being okay.
Right. Would you make the argument that a new video pod should definitely also publish to all of those hubs, or would it be fine to just, if you're doing video centric interviews, would just publishing to YouTube be like a viable, reasonable starting point?
It's a great question. I mean, it feels like it depends on what the video's doing for you. Like if you think the video is a really key part of it, you've got like quotes from papers or figures from papers, or like the emotional experience of these people is really, really important, then you can imagine YouTube being sort of the default home. And then, if there's like short snippets, obviously it can sort of roam the web elsewhere.
Right.
Whereas like if audio and the ideas and the sort of logic of it with, less emotional information is maybe the most key part of what you're doing, then you got to imagine people are going to be like in the car, driving and just want to listen to something, or like, don't want to use their eyes because they stare at screens all day and just want to listen to something and like veg out or go for a walk. And so in that case, like people often are already using the podcast listeners for that, right? Like the, Apple Podcasts or Spotify or what have you. So like it sort of depends on who your audience is and why they're listening and how they want to listen.
Right. My view on this, I'm curious if you kind of think this is like, reasonable or not, but my view is kind of like record video so that you have an asset that can be chopped up and shared on places where video easily distributes, like, YouTube Shorts, TikTok, etc. Because a new thing needs a little bit more visibility and needs to get out there. And then maybe that attracts, maybe people see a video of a talk you're doing, or they hear like a hook that sounds interesting from, browsing on TikTok or YouTube in Shorts, but then they say, I want to actually see, hear the whole thing. And then they go download the audio only version of that. Like, so is that, like
that definitely seems like the right way to do it. It's not the way we did it for the early episodes, which I think like if we could, start over, we definitely would. Like it's definitely the sort of pro move.
Right. How important then is all of the like intros, outros, like that certainly makes it feel more like a finished, polished product. But if people's initial experience may be through a very important clip that kind of extracts a very important idea, is that enough? Like, in a sense, if the marketing or discovery happens through an important idea that gets shared on some other network that doesn't really have like the clip and branding involved, or doesn't have like the intros and branding involved, is it, do you think it would be okay to just have the content and not do a lot of that post-production?
Yeah, it's a good question. Like if 90% of your inbound comes from TikTok, so there's like a short video on TikTok and then people click in, there's like a link to the episode, and like right there and then they listen to the whole episode. I guess it sort of depends too. I mean, a lot of podcasts have ads. Like we don't have ads, but if you have ads, like, I don't know if you want to like click play and, sort of gear up to listen to an hour of something and then be like slammed in the face with an ad, it's slightly painful. Like I always, I've got my like, buttons on my car that skip forward, 15 seconds. So it's like press play and spam the button, right? And then like, okay. And so, I think having a nice cold open and like a quote at the beginning that's a cool part of the story can like overcome the ad a little bit. If you don't have ads and you don't really like, if 90% of people are coming through, the like TikTok video, I could imagine it being much less important. I guess the other piece is you sort of are promising that they'll enjoy the theme, not just the episode. And if they enjoy the theme, then at a certain point, people are going to go from episode to episode. And then, when you have the intro, it does kind of explain like what the heck's going on in this episode, right? Yeah. And I guess the intro might have a summary of the episode, whereas the TikTok video probably does not have a summary. I think summaries at the beginning are helpful, no matter where people come from.
Both cold open, which is like some quote that maybe your guest said that was really insightful or interesting and kind of hooks an audience to be interested. And then do you separately record your own intro after the fact? Like you've had the conversation, all of what was covered, and then you kind of summarize it in your own words?
Yeah. So for listeners, if you go through the podcast, it's like pretty obvious, what happens here. But basically there's like the cold open, exactly like you said. And then there's a repeat intro that's like, welcome to Speed. My name is Peregrine. I'm the host, like 50 years backs companies that make the world a better place. Here's what that is. And then, it's got a little bit about why we started the podcast. And so that gets inserted on every single one. And then we record a custom open that's like, today we're chatting with Calvin Frenchoen, founder of Segment. Segment is a company that connects data sources from A to B. It's sort of the who this person is. There's a bit about what the company does, and then there's a bit about what we talk about.
And is that whole thing like, that's a single clip of you? That's 60 seconds of you, something like that?
Yeah. Maybe,
and it's
roughly a minute.
And it's something that you have to, do you have to have already had the conversation in order to create that? Or is that something that you do ahead of time? Like you could do it off of a Wikipedia article or something.
I tried to do it before in the beginning, and then it just wasn't, it was like, oh shoot, I might need to like delete that and remake it. And it's a little bit like, I don't know, when you're talking to these guests, the guests are like very sort of busy, often very intense people. And when you're recording the intro, it's better, at least my take is it's better to be a little bit relaxed so you can sort of like think through it and get each part right and not like stumble over your words at all. Right. And then sometimes there are topics that come up that then you would highlight in the intro. So like Guy Raz, he definitely does it after because he'll say, like, we talk about so-and-so who accomplished this thing and this other thing. Plus, hear how this person overcame the most difficult challenge you've ever heard of, right? And like, did he know about that challenge going in? Like, no way, right? Some of those episodes, no way. So I just sort of modeled it off that and was like, look, like, this is what I love about how I built this. I'm just going to copy that.
I see. So is how I built this the closest kind of inspiration or kind of format to what you follow?
Yeah. I mean, I think when I was starting my company and definitely before it, How I Built This was just my favorite podcast. I think being in venture, I think it's shifted over a little bit towards Acquired and the Founders Podcast. But I think when I think about like content that's just fun, that's like more sort of emotionally resonant and enjoyable, like How I Built This is just great storytelling and, it feels very intimate. It's about this connection with this person. And so, I'm happy to copy Guy Raz any day.
Right. And what are the things about, like you mentioned, Acquired and Founders? What are the things about those? Are they pretty similar to each other in format from that perspective? Or are there other aspects of them that you think sort of inspire you closer?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if I could quote you the intro. I feel like Acquired, my experience is always like, they're these super long episodes. So, I'll listen to like 30 minutes and then I'll just pick up where I left off because I'm listening to it while I'm driving. And so I'm not totally sure what the intros are.
And they do some like multi-segment deep dive type things too, right? Where they'll have like 4 episodes.
They do.
Span.
Yeah, they'll do like Benchmark Part 1, Benchmark Part 2. There's like Sequoia Part 1. I think there's multi-part Sequoia 1. They've got ads in the beginning for some, intelligence software you can trust.
Right.
And but the thing I love about Acquired is that they are just wicked smart people who really like take the time to do the interviews and get these really full stories. It's sort of like if VCs were doing 60 Minutes or something, or like, these are really professional grade research here, which I really, really love. And they obviously love doing it. So there's a sort of like energy I think a lot of people get from listening to people who are just enjoying themselves, like, sort of being intellectuals. So I think that's really fun. And they're clearly like close friends. So there's that good vibe. Like, there's just sort of a great like camaraderie that you get to experience listening to them.
Right. Do you know much of the history of how that came together?
I actually don't. No. Is there a fun story or?
I feel like I heard somebody offhanded mention something. I certainly couldn't tell their story, but I thought, it's kind of like a friends thing. And I don't know if they were they maybe GSB grads or something, or they were kind of like, Valley adjacent and kind of just wanted to meet more people or something. But I'm always curious about the origin stories of, things like this. And actually that's why, it's fun to chat with you near the beginning of your journey. Maybe we'll look back years from now and you'll be the new Guy Raz or or the new Acquired, and we can sort of see what it looked like at the beginning. That's part of I think stuff that I always love. I have a friend, we call each other business historians. we're always on archive.org. Like, did you see the Stripe webpage when there were 10 people working at Stripe? Like, you can literally go back and see archive.org, what Stripe looked like when it was in its infancy. And I think, those stories about like how it came together. Why did people decide to do this? What did it look like? How did it feel back then? I'm like fascinated by that topic.
Yeah, ditto. I love archive.org for that reason. I'll be asking founders sometimes about things that are, 7 years ago in the very founding of the company. And I'll be like, well, I went back on your blog and the first episode of your, the first blog post you had, like you talked about this, and they're like, oh yeah, that was like a good time. There's sort of like a fun sleuthing that goes into it.
Yeah. I know you mentioned that Acquired did you mention that Acquired runs ads at the beginning of theirs?
Yeah.
And are they sort of structured, I guess, presumably as sort of a media company and not a venture capital firm? So they're more of a direct monetization?
I know. This is slightly embarrassing. I can't remember which author or which host works where, but one of them works at like Pioneer Square Labs, which I think is a venture firm.
Yeah. Was that the
right?
one up in Seattle?
Yeah, that sounds right.
Yeah. But I'm always wondering the trade-off of like, you guys don't do ads, and other venture, kind of media things do ads. And I wonder, like, how do you think about that? Is it like, if you were to be really big, it would make sense, or you just only want to focus on the brand building and the venture capital is the business and monetization, or sort of, because it seems like different people make different trade-offs around that. And is there any rhyme or reason or kind of pattern to that?
Yeah, I haven't thought much about it because the audience just isn't that big right now. Like I think the amount of ad revenue it would generate is just not worth it right now. But yeah, it's a good question. Like because you can imagine podcasts intersecting venture in a lot of different ways. You could imagine being like a venture partner and only 10% of your day to day is actually at like a firm. Right. Or like, adjacent to a firm. And then if that was the case, you'd probably want to run ads because you're probably trying to like, have some kind of cash flow coming from this thing. Or, there's asterisks, right? If you're independently wealthy, maybe you hate ads on principle and are just like, whatever, this is, could imagine that as well. So I think sometimes people think that ads help too, like or not, maybe help is the wrong word, but like, it's such targeted placement that consumers are happy to hear them. Right. So like Huberman Lab, the one of the products he mentions is called, I think it's Inside Tracker, the blood work. Basically, it's just sort of a fancy version of blood work. You go get some blood tests, and then they have this nice PDF that has all the various tests listed and what they mean, and your results and what those results mean. But I like heard about it on Huberman, and I was like, man, I would have never thought to like go do this research myself. And so then I actually went and got one done. And like, the next time I heard it, I was like, all right, you can stop now. Like, but the first time it was actually like, it was valuable. I mean, I'm happy that he decided to put that ad in. Right. And so it's like, there's definitely some trade-off there. I mean, if you had more control over it, you'd probably just be like, oh, like share this with a user, once every couple months, right? It's a little bit different than like the company wants you to share it with the user, every single episode. But, I think the user would probably prefer it to be slightly less often. Right. So I don't know if you had that choice, maybe you'd make it, but.
It's interesting how like undeveloped or underdeveloped that ecosystem is, like kind of audio ads or the placement of those. It's just like, there's so little targeting and tracking available that, how do conversions work? How does source, attribution work? That it seems like it's just been a messy situation for so long, and it doesn't feel like it's about to be cleaned up. But I wonder sort of, how different people make decisions about that. Because sometimes ads can be valuable, but that's not what people are typically showing up for. And in venture, obviously, you have like this great business model that just sort of being in the flow of information is kind of worth it enough usually.
Sorry. Yeah. I mean, I was just going to say the hope is that, entrepreneurs and people who are thinking about starting companies hear the content, get inspired by it, and are like, these are the kind of people that I want to call up to get some advice on my deck, or, try and like plan out the next few steps of my company. And so like that is sort of, the way, we kind of trade this off against other things we might do in venture. Right. But yeah, I think like I don't know, we could have ads at the beginning or like, here's my email, like, do you want a pitch review? But it feels kind of cheesy. So.
Yeah, people will probably just know about you and they can find you online and probably, the good stuff happens. I wonder, so it sounds like you guys all read the book Amped together, and then was that
Amp It
mostly?
Up. Yeah, exactly.
Amp It Up, sorry, okay. So you read that book together, and then did you guys kind of divvy up who was going to do what? And you were just like raising your hand, like, I'm going to do the podcast? Or do you think that like the podcast may have other hosts get involved from the 50 years side? Or is this kind of like the Peregrine project within 50 years?
It definitely could be. Yeah. I think like, I think if we expanded it, there certainly might be an opportunity to like, bring on somebody else who could host it or something. I think like a lot of what makes success in professional life is a tight alignment between what gives you energy and what you do. Yeah. And I think for me, creating this content gives me a lot of energy and I really love it. And so it just ends up being that I'm doing this because I'm going to do a better job because I really enjoy it. And I, prioritize it over other things sort of instinctually because it gives me way more energy. I think like one of the cool stories that inspired it was one of my teammates, Sarah, is a very, very talented person. And she had this idea to create this thing called the Repro Grants. It's sort of like around reproductive health. And she had a lot of sort of, what's the word, like free space to kind of imagine this because she came on as sort of an EIR and she was really just exploring a bunch of different ideas around reproductive health as it related to venture and talking to a ton of teams in the space. And she just sort of became really connected in the space. And then she was like, I want to start sort of like a fast grants program for reproductive health. And because she was so committed to it every single day, all of us would be at stand up and we would see her like bringing this really excited energy that, I think we all get excited by our jobs, right? I mean, we get to help entrepreneurs who are having these huge impacts in the world. But we also do like a bunch of different things, right? We're talking to new entrepreneurs as well as helping current ones. And so it's just like a little bit more split up. Whereas Sarah was like very focused on this Repro Grants initiative. And she was doing, some hiring and some other help for teams as well, but it just had a lot of her energy and she was just really loving it. And so I think we all sort of looked at that and we were like, okay, if you can like pick a project that you're going to enjoy that much, you're going to do a good job because you're just going to pour so much energy into it. Right. And so I think like, could I imagine other people hosting the show? Like, sure. Like, would it work? Would they like intuitively put as much energy into creating it? Like, maybe, but it feels a little bit less likely just because like I sort of enjoy this so much.
Yeah, makes sense. And then I know we're sort of over time already, but one kind of last closer, if I can, is I wonder sort of how do you think about like where this goes, or how do you sort of have a way to measure success or kind of think about it within the team if it's kind of accomplishing the goals that you might have?
Yeah. Like what else could I be working on that could be forwarding our mission at 50 years? Yeah. I mean, part of it is just recording great episodes and having thoughtful tweet threads around it and getting a certain number of shares and getting a certain number of views. I think, if we sort of had it running for longer or, we started like acing all those metrics, we might create metrics around like how many, referrals of great talent could we attribute to it, or how many new companies found out about us via this, or how many times did we answer a, one of our founders' questions via the show. I think like those could be interesting metrics, but yeah, so far it's just, publishing a certain number of episodes, and getting a certain number of shares and downloads. Right.
It's cool. Well, it's great. I mean, I'm glad that you could join for this because I'm sort of a noob at this and kind of figuring my way out. And since you're a few steps ahead, it really helps me just kind of hear from somebody who's kind of recently been there, but sort of beyond where I am. So thanks for
happy to share. Yeah, of course. I think one thing that I love about your take on this, DK, is you have this incredible like curiosity and openness, and just like try things and see how they go, which is just really, really fun to watch and be adjacent to and learn from. So yeah, thanks for having me on.
All right. Thanks so much.